The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked neatly into a crisp white envelope with the HOA's gold emblem stamped across the front. I opened it absent-mindedly, sipping my coffee, not expecting anything serious. But as my eyes darted across the bold, cold words, my hand froze. You are hereby ordered to remove the vessel from your property within 10 days. Failure to comply will result in fines of $500 per day and potential legal action. They called it a vessel. They didn't even have the decency to call it what it was, a boat. Not just any boat, it was my boat. The one my late father and I had rebuilt together with our bare hands. The one I had sailed through hurricanes as part of my service to this country. The one that had carried me through storms, both on the water and in life. And now, a group of power-hungry neighbors with nothing better to do were threatening to take it from me. I could feel the anger rising in my chest. But I didn't yell. I didn't crumple the letter and storm out the door like they probably hoped I would. Instead, I set the paper down slowly, finished my coffee, and whispered to myself, they have no idea who they're messing with. Because I wasn't just a man with a boat. I was a Federal Maritime Officer, sworn to uphold the very laws these people were now trampling on. When I moved into the neighborhood 2 years earlier, I never wanted trouble. I picked the house because it had a wide driveway, perfect for trailering my 28-foot vessel, the Liberty. I was at sea for months at a time, and when I came home, I liked seeing her there, standing proudly like a reminder of my life's work. Most neighbors smiled and waved. A few even came over to ask about my journeys, and I happily shared stories of the storms I'd navigated and the rescues I'd been part of. But then there was Harold. Harold was the HOA president. A man who lived for rules, fines, and the satisfaction of making others bend to his will. He didn't see my boat as a story, or a piece of history, or even a vessel tied to a man's duty and honor. To him, it was an eyesore, against regulations, and detracting from property values. He and his board hid behind their bylaws like a shield, throwing them around with smug arrogance. But what Harold didn't realize was this: HOA rules do not trump federal law. And in this case, they had wandered directly into waters far outside their jurisdiction. At first, I tried to handle it calmly. I showed up at the next HOA meeting, letter in hand, prepared to explain. Good evening, I said, standing before the board and the small group of neighbors gathered. I received this notice about my boat, and I believe there's been a mistake. Federal law protects the storage of registered vessels used for maritime service, especially when that vessel is a matter of national readiness. Harold leaned back in his chair, smirking. This isn't federal property. This is an HOA. Our rules are clear. No boats in driveways. A few neighbors looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. One elderly woman even spoke up. Harold, his boat doesn't bother me. It's not like it's falling apart. It's beautiful. But Harold waved her off. Rules are rules. If we let one person break them, everyone will. I looked him dead in the eye. You don't want to test this line, Harold. Because if you do, you're going to find yourself answering to more than just me. He laughed, and that was the moment I knew. He thought he was untouchable. The next morning, I got to work. I filed a formal complaint with the Federal Maritime Commission, outlining the HOA's overreach. I included documentation of my service, the vessel's registry, and the fact that law enforcement was attempting to obstruct federal maritime readiness. Within a week, the review process was underway. Inspectors visited the neighborhood, asking questions, taking photos, reviewing documents. Harold's smug confidence quickly began to crack. At the next HOA meeting, the boardroom was packed. People whispered nervously, unsure of what was coming. I stood in the back, arms folded, as the federal investigators laid it out clearly. HOA bylaws cannot override federal statutes. This vessel is protected, and any attempt to penalize or restrict its presence is a violation. Furthermore, this HOA will now be subject to a compliance review for misuse of authority. The silence was deafening. Harold's face turned red, then pale. For once, he had nothing to say. But the story didn't end there. Because while the review unfolded, something remarkable happened. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet started standing up. I've been fined for having my flag too big, one man said. They told me to cut down my garden because it wasn't uniform, another added. They charged me $200 because my trash can was visible from the street. The HOA had been bullying people for years. My fight with the boat had given them the courage to speak out. And together, we pushed back. By the time the federal review was finished, the HOA was ordered to amend its bylaws, refund thousands of dollars in unfair fines, and replace its leadership. Harold resigned in disgrace, unable to face the community he had once lorded over. As for me, I kept my boat. Every evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking at the Liberty. Not just as a boat, but as a symbol. She had weathered storms at sea, and now, she had weathered one on land. And both had proven the same lesson. Sometimes you don't need to shout or fight with fists, you just need to stand firm, know your ground, and let truth do the heavy lifting. The neighborhood changed after that. People smiled more, talked more, and the air felt lighter without Harold's shadow looming over everyone. My boat wasn't an eyesore anymore, it became a landmark, a reminder of what it means to fight for what's right. And every time I saw a neighbor walking by, pausing to admire her, I felt that swell of pride. Not just for being a Federal Maritime Officer, but for showing that no matter how big or small the battle, when you stand for justice, you can change more than just your own story, you can change an entire community. The night after that first HOA meeting, I barely slept. I kept hearing Harold's laugh echoing in my head, that smug little chuckle as if he had already won. But deep down, I knew something Harold didn't. HOA power stops where federal law begins. And this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about principle, about fairness, about not letting people like Harold bully others into silence. I sat at my desk, pulling out folders I hadn't touched in years. Certificates of service, vessel registration, copies of federal maritime statutes that clearly outlined the rights of maritime officers and active-use vessels. As I spread them out, memories rushed back, the sound of waves pounding against the hull during a storm, the cries for help from fishermen caught in rough waters, the relief of pulling them aboard to safety. That boat wasn't just metal and fiberglass. It was a lifeline, my lifeline, and I'd be damned if I let Harold strip that away. The very next morning, I filed the complaint. Federal channels aren't quick, but they're thorough. I knew that once the wheels were in motion, the HOA would be forced to explain themselves. And something told me Harold wouldn't enjoy being on the receiving end of that spotlight. A week later, my hunch proved right. I was in my driveway, checking the trailer tires on the Liberty, when two black SUVs rolled into the neighborhood. Neighbors peeked through blinds and cracked open doors as three inspectors stepped out, badges glinting in the sunlight. They weren't there for me, they were there for the HOA. By evening, the whole community was buzzing. Rumors flew faster than wildfire. Some thought Harold had broken the law. Others wondered if the HOA was going to be dissolved altogether. All I knew was that Harold's smile had vanished. That Friday, another HOA meeting was called, this time packed tighter than I'd ever seen. Neighbors filled every seat, lined the walls, even stood in the hallway. I could see the tension on Harold's face as he tried to maintain control. "Let's all remain calm," he said, tapping the microphone. "This is just a standard review. Nothing to be concerned about." But the moment the federal investigators began speaking, calm was the last thing in the room. Based on the complaint filed and preliminary findings, one inspector said firmly, "This HOA has overstepped its authority. Federal law supersedes local regulations where maritime readiness is concerned. Attempting to penalize the storage of a federally registered vessel used in service is unlawful." The crowd gasped. Some neighbors clapped quietly, others exchanged wide-eyed looks. Harold's face turned red, then pale. The inspector wasn't finished. "Furthermore, we've received multiple testimonies about questionable enforcement practices, excessive fines, inconsistent rule applications, and possible misuse of funds. These issues will be investigated thoroughly. Until then, any enforcement actions related to this vessel are suspended." The room erupted. I stayed quiet, arms crossed in the back, watching Harold squirm in his chair. For once, he wasn't in control. The man who had laughed in my face was now staring at the floor, sweat dripping down his forehead. And as I looked around at my neighbors, people who had lived under his thumb for years, I realized something bigger was happening. This wasn't just about my boat anymore. This was about the whole neighborhood finally standing up to a tyrant. After that meeting, the neighborhood was never the same. The inspector's words had lit a spark. For years, people had whispered about Harold's unfair rules, but no one dared speak too loudly. Now, with federal eyes watching, neighbors started coming out of the shadows. 2 days later, I was walking my dog when Mr. Green, a quiet man in his 70s, stopped me at the sidewalk. He leaned on his cane, voice low, as if still afraid Harold might hear. They fined me last year because my flagpole was 3 inches taller than regulation, he muttered. 3 inches. I paid $200 I couldn't afford. Maybe now I'll finally get that money back. Then came Maria, a single mom who lived 3 houses down. She waved me over to her porch, tears in her eyes. They told me my kids' bikes weren't aesthetic, and threatened to fine me if they weren't hidden. Bikes. For children, she said, shaking her head. I felt trapped, like I couldn't even let my kids be kids. And she wasn't the only one. The stories poured out like a flood. Garden beds torn up, flags removed, fines for trash cans visible for more than an hour. It wasn't just about rules, it was about control. I listened to every word, my heart heavy. These weren't just petty complaints. This was a community living under fear, and Harold was the man who thrived on it. The next HOA meeting was nothing like the ones before. This time, the neighbors came not to sit quietly but to fight back. The room was packed, voices buzzing with anger and determination. When Harold tried to call the meeting to order, the crowd drowned him out. You fined me for planting sunflowers. You threatened to sue me over my Christmas lights. You've been bleeding us dry for years. The inspectors sat in the corner, quietly taking notes. I watched Harold's face turn from annoyance to panic. He banged the gavel, shouting for order, but no one listened. His reign of silence had ended. I stood up then, my voice cutting through the chaos. Enough, I said firmly. The room hushed. All eyes turned to me. This isn't just about my boat. This is about all of us. For too long, this HOA has acted like it owns us, instead of serving us. That ends now. We're neighbors, not subjects. And it's time we remind Harold and his board who this community really belongs to. The crowd erupted in applause, louder than any gavel could silence. For the first time, Harold looked small. Over the next week, things escalated quickly. The inspectors launched a full audit, and the more they dug, the worse it got. Financial records showed thousands of dollars unaccounted for. Fines collected but never explained. Maintenance fees that didn't line up with any actual maintenance. The walls around Harold were crumbling, and he knew it. I caught him one evening pacing in front of his house, barking into his phone. His voice carried across the quiet street. They can't do this to me. I am the HOA. But the truth was, his power was slipping away with every passing day. And the very people he had once controlled were the ones tearing it from his hands. The storm he had built was finally turning on him. Calm after the storm, the day of reckoning came on a Thursday evening. The HOA board had called an emergency meeting after the federal inspectors released their preliminary findings. Word spread fast, and by 6 o'clock the community center was overflowing. This time, no one came with fear in their eyes. They came with hope, with determination, with the fire of people who had been pushed too far and were finally ready to stand tall. Harold sat at the front table, pale and trembling, a stack of papers in front of him. The gavel in his hand shook as he tried to call the meeting to order. But the inspectors beat him to it. After reviewing the records and interviewing residents, the lead inspector announced, "It is clear that this HOA has engaged in repeated overreach, unfair fines, and financial mismanagement. Effective immediately, the board is dissolved pending re-election. Funds collected under questionable circumstances will be refunded." Gasps filled the room, followed by a roar of applause. People clapped, cheered, even hugged one another. And Harold, his gavel slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. He stood up, his face burning red, trying to salvage his pride. "This is outrageous. You can't just—" "Yes, we can," the inspector interrupted, his tone sharp. "And we just did." Harold stormed out, his once loyal board members trailing behind him like rats abandoning a sinking ship. For the first time in years, he wasn't the man in charge. He was just another neighbor. The weeks that followed felt like a new dawn. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now waved, shared coffee, and laughed together. Gardens blossomed again. Children's bikes sat proudly in driveways. Flags flew high without fear of fines. And my boat, the Liberty, remained in her place, standing proud in my driveway like a silent guardian. She wasn't just a boat anymore. She was a symbol of resistance, of justice, of what happens when good people refuse to be bullied. One evening, Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who had once defended me at the first meeting, walked over. She laid her hand on my arm and smiled softly. "You didn't just save your boat," she said. "You saved this neighborhood." Her words hit me harder than any storm I'd ever sailed through. Months later, a new HOA board was elected, made up of fair, honest neighbors who wanted unity, not control. Rules became guidelines, not weapons. Instead of fines, there were conversations. Instead of fear, there was trust. And as for Harold, he quietly sold his house and moved away, too ashamed to face the community he had tried to dominate. On the day he left, I watched his moving truck drive past the Liberty. For a brief second, his eyes met mine. No words were spoken, but the message was clear: the tide had turned, and he was powerless against it. Today, when I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset reflect off the polished hull of my boat, I think back to that first letter. That single sheet of paper meant to intimidate me. It could have ended there, with me giving in, hiding my boat, and shrinking under the weight of rules that were never meant to serve. But instead, it became the start of something greater, a fight that gave a voice to an entire community. The Liberty is still here. She'll always be here, not just as a vessel of the sea, but as a reminder that when you stand firm against injustice, you don't just protect what's yours, you inspire others to rise beside you. And in the end, that's the greatest victory of all.